Good evening. You're listening to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight is the young millennial 20-something Professor Pixel. I should say Father Pixel because we are covering, for his first time, the 1980 film from John Carpenter, The Fog, a ghost story about revenge. Pixel, I got to sit there and say, when you said, hey, do you know anything about The Fog? I shit a brick because, man, John Carpenter is one of the few people I mark out for, despite his politics, his view on things. I love his films as a kid growing up. It was one of those things where I would watch a bunch of his films, didn't realize they were all by him, and went, I love every single one. And one thing that's great about them is that they're infinitely rewatchable. What do you think?
I think for a lot of them, that is indeed the case. As for The Fog, I was surprised just how good this movie was. I don't know. I didn't know exactly what to expect. And with a name like The Fog, you're like, how can it be good? Well, they show you. And it might be one of my favorite John Carpenter films, if not one of my favorite horror films.
Well, a little bit of background about John Carpenter and The Fog. Just most people that are hardcore fans know this already. But there is a younger crowd that has been influenced by him. I think of a movie like from about 7, 8 years ago called It Follows, which I think is very Carpenter-esque, and a few others as well. John Carpenter was a guy that survived Hollywood by writing some movie treatments and scripts. He was influenced by like 1950s science fiction stuff and westerns. So there's always like sometimes a western element in his theme in his movies. He's one of the guys that to me popularized the, hey, I have a very low budget. I have to make do with what I have. He scored his own music because he grew up in a musical family. He wrote a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it, directed it, of course. And most of his films that he partnered with Dean Cundy, they look absolutely phenomenal. And that's the one thing that I always say is that growing up as a child in the 70s and a teenager in the 80s, whenever we would get together on the streets and be talking about the John Carpenter film that we saw or whatever, we'd be like, oh, this is a cool scene where this and that happened. To this day, I still go back and I put on a John Carpenter film and I go, it works for what he's doing. And we can talk about high production values, low production values. It's how you put them all together and how they sync up. And for the most part, John Carpenter always hits a winner in my eyes. Not all the time, but most of the time. And he's kind of like the template for me, what it means to have a micro budget film. Those people that have a vision see it out and they get it done, and it translates to what they want. And I think, especially in today's age, it's really hard to do that. Too many boxes to check. For The Fog, obviously the score is incredible, and he did that. He's sometimes had people help him out, but I just want to just dive right in and talk about why The Fog was made. He originally did Halloween. He didn't know at the time that it was doing good, but it had legs. And all of a sudden, somebody approached him while he was making The Fog on a super low budget, wanted to do like a two film deal with him. So he did it, and him and Deborah Hill, who's been involved with him for a long time, they had this idea of like they had this picture of a fog coming in, and they heard a story about revenge, which that this movie, The Fog, is based off something that actually happened. And what I instantly love about this is that when we start off with the film, we get a great opening monologue by an older professional actor who's telling a bunch of kids around the campfire at night the history of what's going on. And we're told at the very beginning as a watcher what's going to happen in the film. And so there's a certain pacing that Carpenter has, the way he takes the time to make usually the towns that he's in a part of the character. I just think it's a phenomenal opening gambit here too, and the shot initially of just at night coming over, even though it was probably shot during the day and they put a blue film on it, of them in the beach and that theme hits. I can put that on every time there's a hint of fall in the air here in Central Florida and go, man, it feels like it's time to watch The Fog. What's your take on this whole opening bit and the setup? What did you notice?
In the opening, I wasn't sure exactly what was going on, and I was watching with somebody and they said, who tells this story to kids? But it's very interesting setting up the lore of what we're about to explore. And so getting to that point where we can actually enjoy the film itself and get into building some characters. I don't believe we ever see any of these people in the opening well, not gambit, but opening scene again. I can't remember him.
The kid.
Oh, we see the one. That's right, one kid.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot that, but we don't see anybody else in it, so it's kind of loose in a way where it's disconnected, but I can't imagine the movie without it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you get somebody like John Houseman, the guy that's giving this delivery. It's so hard to nail it because if you underdo it, immediately you're bought off and it doesn't work. And if you overdo it, you're like, come on, man. It's just one of those things where the guy does a great job. He was the professor in, I think, The Paper Chase. I don't know if it was the movie or a TV show or whatever. I think it was the movie that he was in. So I remember him because in the 80s, it would be that he had this distinct voice, the way he delivered things. And it was just awesome. It's one of those things where, again, John Carpenter would get good actors and a lot of smaller ones that were roughly the age of the characters they were playing. This is obviously the second film that has um, Jamie Lee Curtis in it, even though I wouldn't say she's a major star. She's a part of it. It's an ensemble film. You've got Hal Holbrook in here. He's just a creepy bastard, and he plays the father in here. But let's just go through some of the acts and just kind of go over a little bit topically here. Like I said before, I'm a huge fan of Carpenter and the score. I do like how Carpenter has strong female characters in it because we see that here in Antonio Bay, you've got Adrienne Barbeau being a disc jockey on the evening shift, I think from 5 or 6 p.m. to about 1 in the morning. And you get some great shots of this lighthouse. It's the 100th anniversary of, I guess, the forming of the town or whatever, which will be coming to play because as a kid, you're watching going, why do I care? This is kind of slow and dull and boring. But then when you realize, oh, it's all related, there's no waste. It's great. But there's some neat shots right after the ghost story of the town kind of acting funny on its own. You see a guy working in a convenience store late at night, and things start to shatter, and you see a gas station with some lights going on and off, and the gas kind of coming out, and we don't know what's going on. It almost seems like it was an earthquake or something. I'm going, God, it's been a long time since I've seen this movie. Am I forgetting something? Or that was my initial take. But what I like is initially you get the setup for the story, which is the important thing. And the characters there to support the story. We get the town being set up as a character, and then we dive right into one of the main leads that's the main character as well as some others, and eventually, like in a lot of Carpenter films, like a lot of westerns, it's going to end up with a lot of these characters not having crossed paths, but all kind of meeting together at the end to kind of either defeat or hold off the evil forces coming from the outside. And this is, like I say, a common thing that you would see in a lot of Carpenter films too. So when you started watching this here at the beginning, did it seem different or did it seem slow? I mean, how did you feel watching it?
No, I don't think it felt slow. Because one of the first things that we get is in fact an attack, as it were. So going through the town, we do get to see some of the people, and these are characters. We have to know them to know what exactly this fog will affect. But when we get to see the fishermen as they're out on their boat, and suddenly there's a ship right by them, and we see exactly what happens to him. To go into detail, I think it's a strong opening. I really do, because we get to meet these characters. Some of them do have some great chemistry. I think I can't remember the guy, but the guy that is with Jamie Lee Curtis, who gets picked up along the way, I think they go ahead and instantly have some dialogue.
Nick Castle, who's the actual name of the person that plays Michael Myers, I believe.
Oh,
so
well, there you go.
Have names because they all work and know each other. But that's Tom Atkins. He's going to become a regular after this film and Carpenter stuff. Absolutely, Tom Atkins.
Yeah, and getting to see the bonds that are actively forging, because she's been hitchhiking for about a week at the scene, and now these two instantly are taken to each other. And then we get to see the radio DJ, who has a nice, calming, smooth voice, and her son. And the son is the kid that we talked about before. Getting these bonds is important to go ahead and get into the main plot. And I feel that going through this wasn't hard. not at all. And in fact, I'm going to say I like it even more than his most iconic film, which is Halloween.
Well, everyone has their preferences. To me, the opening scene had a neat little part where Hal Holbrook was seen as a priest drinking, and I guess he's got somebody that works in there and wants some money, walks off. I totally missed it the first time I saw this, and it's been a long time since I've seen this. That's actually John Carpenter himself, like in a bit role. I'm like, oh, you bastard, you put yourself in the film. I'm like, that's kind of funny. Because of course this is 41 years ago, roughly, when it came out. Yeah, it really reminds me of being at home in a town where things are a little quieter and smoother, and you would see hitchhikers quite frequently or whatever, and it wasn't really a big deal here. But obviously things happen while they're driving down the road here at the middle of the night, because it is the witching hour from 12 to 1. You know, things do happen bad. But yeah, we see the boat out there, that we see the actual fog overtaking it, and you're like, what the hell is going on here? And that's part of the mystery. So I say it's a ghost story because it is. It's really like a revenge story. To me, this is not a slasher film. This is not really a horrific film, or it's definitely not a Michael Myers. This is more of like a Lovecraftian kind of thing, where there's a figure that we can't see, or don't know where it comes from and why it's there. Except for here, it's wrapped up in a version of a ghost thing. So the next day, when they go looking for this boat, and they realize, hey, the wind and the path of the boat and all that, something's off, and they actually go looking for it. There's a sense of urgency, and I think Tom Atkins nails it as a strong everyman masculine kind of guy, without looking completely jacked and all that too. He's a solid lead actor. And later on, when we talk other Carpenter films, we'll see this as well. But he definitely nails it, because he's already boned Jamie Lee. We don't see it because it's happened that quick. But she doesn't appear too trampy with it. It just seems to be like, yeah, whatever. Like you said, they hit it off. But then we start finding out with the kid the next day, and it's just like a kid to discover stuff. He's on the beach at night. It's a beautiful shot. He sees something shiny, and then he goes to run after, and he puts his fishing pole down, and then instead of the shiny thing, he sees a piece of driftwood, which happens to be from the ship, which his mom gets, and we see stuff that happens. But one thing I want to point about the film, because we're just kind of trying not to go into too great a detail, is we get to see the home of where the kid lives, and where, like, I guess his grandmother's babysitting or something. Carpenter's theme's playing over it. The way this movie is shot, they shoot it in aspect ratio where it looks really, really wide. So you've got something, if you got like a center shot going on, you've got to have stuff on like the left or right a little bit, or you have to center or balance it. So even though this was a super low budget film, it doesn't look like it. And if you have like the Blu-ray or something that's been restored, despite anything that may date it from the styles of hair and dress and all that, and it's not really that bad, it really is really just warm and rich looking too, and it's great. And every once in a while, when they show these older films on the big screen and you go see them, most of them look great. Some don't translate well, but this one definitely does, because on my transfer, oh, it's beautiful. We do get to mention briefly some other characters. I forgot that I think it's Tippi Hedren is in here. She plays the mayor. Again, another strong role, who has an assistant. She's the lady in the birds. And apparently she's a
Ooh.
fan of Carpenter's work. So she actually had called Carpenter up and said, hey, if you have any roles for a middle-aged woman in your films, I'm a fan of yours. I'd be more than happy to act in them. And so when this movie got made, there she is. And I thought she's phenomenal in this. And we'll talk more about her later on when we talk other Carpenter films. But there's something about the way it's shot. They're driving on the ocean coast that just draws you in. There's not a lot of people. There's not a lot of high rises, but it all deals with these groups of people with all these A, B, and C level stories that they all meet at the end that just work. And we, of course, find out that the father had discovered his grandfather's log and diary in the church that he's in, and that'll come back to be a main factor in it, because he, about halfway through the story, says to everybody, look, this is what happened. We're worshiping tonight in our 100-year celebration murderers, because this is what happened. And he's not comfortable with it. And despite, him having a drink, because almost every father is portrayed as an alcoholic, Hal Holbrook's just great in here as well. So to me, before we even really talk about, like, say, the third act and the final part and any other highlights, I just got to say it's well acted. It's well crafted. You can't go wrong by, say, studying this film if you were interested in trying to figure out how to tell a story and using film as your medium. And it's also a type of film that, if you close your eyes and just listen to it rather than watch it, yeah, you're going to miss out on the visuals of the fog and the ghost and all that. But there's something enthralling about it too. Some films you just can't do that with, or the type. But this is one you can listen to. It makes sense. There's not a lot of fluff. Everything seems to work in clicks, and I can't really think of too many bad spots in it, really. Before we talk about the third act and what happens there too, anything you want to point out that stands out to you?
Um, as for the second and getting into the real meat of what is coming, which is the final act, I think, well, once again, it's just phenomenally acted. The everything feels like it matters, and you said the word fluff, and a lot of things can have those kinds of scenes. I don't think this does. Everything in this that we see leads up to what we're coming to, and that is, I feel, really important for a good story. And well, are we including all the major deaths into the third act? Because I don't think I think there's a moment where we see like Nick and Elizabeth as the corpse is taken in,
Hmm.
and she's left alone with the corpse, and I
So
I
that was
couldn't help
put in
thinking.
because originally when they did the film,
Mhm.
they finished it and they sent it off, and then the people upstairs were like, "This is kind of boring. We need to amp up the violence and the gore." So they had to go back and rescore the film and add some reshoots to it. Because while the film was playing, this is, I think, back in the analog days, Carpenter would sit there while the movie's playing and just score it himself. And maybe he had an assistant, somebody that he was working with, depending on what film and what he was trying to get out of it. So, yeah, they added this whole scene just to have a little more of a fright factor because the body that they found on the ship that went missing, they found it the next day. It looks like he had drowned, even though he was inside the ship and there was no sign of water in the ship. And how could that happen? This happened last night when
And
he's
his
got
eyes are
the,
gouged out.
yeah, and it's so they amped up some of that with the ghost sequence at the end because it turns out there's, I think, 6 people that are related to the original founding members of the town from 100 years ago, and that's what these ghosts want revenge for because they want their gold. So yeah, that's why this was put in because I agree with you. It's like, well, wait a minute, he's just going back to his Halloween tricks. Well, no, this is set up specifically for that too. I've seen a few interviews where Carpenter and other people were basically describing, yeah, this is why we had to go back and do it. It's only a 90-minute film too, so I mean, they had to make sure every scene counts too. And it's just one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's there. You probably wouldn't miss if it wasn't, but it's supposed to, I think, add up to the creep factor a little bit.
Yeah, no, and you know what? I'm actually, most of the time I'm against uh, studio interference, as it were, because I believe that a story is important to be told how it's supposed to be. But at the same time, I feel like this scene does that a lot, and the corpse it like carves the number 3 into the floor and lets us know there's a count to this.
Yep.
But I think now is pretty much a safe point to get to the end. You made the point. The lore behind this story, I feel, is great. They went at how the founders got together and they made it so that way a ship would sink, so that way they wouldn't have a leper colony nearby.
Yeah,
And
that's disgusting.
they
It's
used the
absolutely
money,
true.
yeah, they used
Yeah.
blood money to build the town.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, but that adds so much to it. It's just a little bit that's added here and there that makes this end so great. And I'll hand it back to you now.
Well, it's a cynical thing, and I like that because Carpenter does have that in a lot of his movies, and he does have a sense of humor too. But I think as a kid watching it, it makes sense. And as an adult watching it, you can catch things that maybe you didn't see if you're young when you watch this. Now, I think people, when they think of the Fog, you can go, "Oh, that movie with the girl that can't run," in the Liam Neeson movies, Taken movies. I think she's in it in 2005 because that was a remake and nobody liked it. I think that actually kind of revitalized a little bit of interest in Carpenter because about 15, 20 years ago, you saw potential remakes. You saw like a loose remake of The Thing or prequel, if you want to call it. You saw this. You've seen a lot of directors coming up now that were influenced by Carpenter because of what he was able to do. And Carpenter would be the first one to tell you that, hey, his job is to make a film and get it done on time, under budget, whatever you call it. And he didn't have a big budget, so how do you make it work? Well, the fact that he had a vision attracted people like Dean Cundy and other professionals working with it. So his group, as Carpenter's movies started to do really well because they did make money, um, they all have a tendency to work together a little bit. And Adrienne Barbeau, she gets shit on a lot because she's thought of as a, you know, an attractive woman with big assets, and she's a horrible actress. And I think she's fine for what she is, but a lot of these characters or actors you'll see being used in other films. But even the practical effects of the fog actually moves. It's not CGI. They're practical effects. That's what I think it's I think it's hard to make that look passable, let alone good. And they did a good job with the scenes that you see with the fog, because that's what it's all about. What's in the
Yeah.
fog? Yeah, so at the end, the fog basically kind of creeps into the town in the evening while they're actually having their town celebration. Like maybe 50 people are sitting around. The mayor, she's giving a speech. They're all lighting candles. You see the fog like attacking the generators, and the electricity and everything's going out. And they all end up basically running together and finding sense of safety at the church. And what's interesting here at the church is that um, even though her kid escapes and they all end up there at the church, you get to see the actual ghosts come out. They've got like hooks and stuff like that. It's shot well. They don't speak. They don't talk. There's no whatever. They're just a force of evil. That they don't. We don't have to know why they're. Um, we do know why actually they have their backstory, so we don't have to sit there and have them tell us like they're an evil genius. We don't care. We're seeing the results of, you know, a cursed town based off of something that makes sense. So we're not rooting for the ghosts because the other people don't know they're innocent. So it's a nice little kind of cynical way to do it. And when they get to it, and there's like, I guess you want to call it the final fight scene or battle, if you will, good versus evil, all these people against this force of evil. You get some great shots of night of the fog creeping in over the hills, over the lighthouse. But then the father realizes what the whole deal is with it. And while they're trying to block all the windows and doors and the fog's still creeping in, he reaches in and he finds in the wall where he found the diary, he finds their gold, because apparently his grandfather, I guess, had melted it down and made a gold cross for it, because and he had gotten buried with it, so they didn't even know it. So Hal Holbrook, playing the priest, he actually gives this gold cross to them, and it's kind of, I think it works for me, even though it's super low budget. He takes this gold cross, which is, I don't know, 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, whatever. And gold is extremely heavy per ounce. So that, I mean, he's struggling with it, and he goes to hand it with him. He's like, take me, take me. And it's cool. You see all the ghosts come up there, and then this bright light shines up from the cross and all that. And you see Jamie Lee Curtis. You see Adrienne Barbeau up at the lighthouse. She's at the top getting chased by some too. And let's just say that I don't even want to call them bad guys. The ghosts get their gold. Um, Everything seems to kind of recede away from town. The curse seems to be lifted. You get a beautiful, beautiful closing shot of the ocean there, where it just lingers for a little bit, and she's making some comment over the airwaves about stuff. And the very last scene is Hal Holbrook kind of looking around by himself, like, "Wow, it's over." Um, and then, of course, we see some fog creeping in. Cuts away. We see one final ghost chopping his head off. Boom, end credits. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it needs it needs its six, and you know it has its gold. And I really do enjoy the ending, as it were. And even though I think the father giving it should have paid something towards it, you gotta pay your debts in full, as it were. And so I think it works out well. Overall, I really do love this movie. And I didn't expect to. When I expected that, okay, I might enjoy this. It might be fun. But it's really great, just from the story itself and just the entire cast and their delivery of everything.
I think that it's a movie that has great atmosphere, and I think it's hard to have a movie that that does that, because sometimes we get actors that overdo it or underdo it, and you get a situation where you go, okay, this is the scene where this or that. But finding a tone of a movie and keeping everything revolving around it isn't always what happens in film, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think of a movie like, say, Rocky, the very first one, has a certain tone and it sticks with it, and everything supports that. And I think it has like this force multiplier effect at the end where it really works for you if you're a big Rocky fan, and I am. Here in The Fog, this is a movie that you can't really watch over and over again, but it's very rewatchable. It has, like I said, great music. The theme to it's phenomenal. Carpenter, like I say, does his own scores. He actually tours now occasionally and just plays the themes with of a lot of the stuff that he's written, and he plays with his son, and that's like a second or third act in his life. He scored the David Gordon Green Halloween movie from a few years ago, and I think is doing the next two, the one that's getting ready to release here in a few weeks, and then the third one coming out next year. So he is known for being kind of like a Michelangelo, where he can do a lot of different things where some people can't do it, and he had to do it because how else was the movie going to get made? So I prefer a filmmaker that has a vision that does something like it rather than relies on a bunch of CGI and a ton of stuff that you get. I've always liked practical effects, and a big part of me liking all this comes from the fact that I just watching them, I enjoy these films. I feel them, and to be able to evoke a response like that without going too much over the top or whatever. Like I say, Carpenter, there's a cynicism with him in his films. Really like it a lot. It's a decent ghost story, and we don't get a lot of ghost stories. I think a lot of people think, no, it's too gothic, it's too whatever, it won't work in film today. We don't get a lot of them. And the final thing I'll say, besides go check this movie out, especially if you're younger and you haven't seen it, it's not a horror, it's not a slasher, it's a ghost story, which we don't get too many of these days. But another reason why they had to amp up the violence in here and put some of those scenes in there wasn't necessarily because it was boring. I think, even though we talked about that, is the fact that you already had Halloween being somehow thought of as the original movie that started the slasher craze. Some would go back a few years and say Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but then you actually had Friday the 13th, and from about 1980 on, tons of slasher films all through the 80s, dying off into the 90s, and so it seemed like the general appetite for violence for moviegoers at that time was really starting to come into its own. And that's why people say, well, why was there so many slasher films in the 80s? Well, because the audiences went and saw them, and they made money, and they did well. That's why there wasn't many of them in the 70s or 60s. So you get something like this that has a little bit of in there. It's still really not a slasher film. It's just a revenge thriller, and
Yeah.
that's it. And it's a perfect movie to watch in the fall season. Final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. This is different from Halloween, but somehow the same brilliant man managed to make two great things, and he made much more, obviously. But talking about this specifically, even though they're two different types of stories, you can feel his touch on it, and it's really just a wonderful film overall.
Yeah, if you start watching them, you know it's a Carpenter film, and it can make you look at stuff and go, yeah, I get it now. So really good stuff. I'd like to thank everybody for listening, checking out The Fog here on the Xtreme Movie Show. It's one of our favorite directors, meaning mine. I'm glad the young millennial man, 20-something Professor Pixel, likes it as well, too. We're going to be checking out a few more Halloween movies as the month goes by. We've done a few others. Check them out. This will be dropping here soon, and maybe we'll do some more Carpenter. For Father Pixel, everybody involved here at the Extreme Movie Show, thanks for listening, guys. Check us out on Facebook on the Extreme Movie Show page. Thanks for you guys that are retweeting and sending comments in as the channel continues to grow, and it's really close march to 1,000 subs and get monetized. This is starting to become a lot more serious, where we have a lot more fun, but now we're going, hey, there's still an appetite for these older films that we like to cover here on the Extreme Movie Show. So thanks for listening. Have a good night. And as always, stay extreme.